me this morning. You're here to listen to Dr. Frans Cronje. Over to you, Dr. Cronje. I am going to make you a co-host right now, and then you can do what you need to do. Give me just one moment, please. Just trying to find Dr. Cronje to make him, I see it's all here in alphabet, just bear with me please. Jess, if you can see it, if you can just make Dr. Cronje co-host, please, thank you.
Maybe while we do this, John, my colleague who's with us, my chief of staff, you can just say a little bit about what we do, John, and so on, and I'll get the technical side going.
Cool. So welcome to everyone. Good to have you here. We are from the Center for Risk Analysis, a consultancy that focuses on assessing political and economic risk within South Africa and the broader global environment. We advise clients on actions to take and strategies they can take in response to risks, and focus very much on scenario planning in the context of that. Y en este contexto también quisiera dar la bienvenida a todos los hispanohablantes en esta reunión. Como es una sesión de la Cámara de Comercio Española, les queremos dar la bienvenida y si tienen preguntas al final estaríamos a su disposición. Muchas gracias.
Impressive, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frans.
Right, excellent. Good morning, everybody. I take it you can all hear me, and you should see on your screens a lightning storm over Johannesburg and the title, Weathering the Storm. If you're not seeing that, there is a problem and you should tell us and we will fix it. The brief from me for you this morning will have 10 components and then an 11th. And to give you a sense of where we're going to go, I'll take you through a lot of that now. Number one, we're going to show you the latest political polling on South Africa and the question that leads to, the long-term prospects for the political survival of the ANC. From there, public opinion in the country. What do people think? Where are they at on the state of the place, and what do they want from their government? It's not always what our clients expect. From there, we'll go to 3, the broader political trends, how the parties have stacked up against each other. And after showing you that, I'll tell you it's the wrong place to look if you want to understand the long-term political evolution of the country, because the biggest political player in the country now is no longer one of its political parties. Once we put 1 to 3 together, we'll suggest to you that it's plausible now that South Africa could this decade undergo a political transition on a scale of what last happened here in the 1980s and the 1990s. And that will take us to point 4 in the question of reform. Is reform going to happen? And we'll give you an unambiguous answer to that and some very deep dive insights into the internal balances of power of South Africa's government and its ruling party. And on Ace Magashula, I think he's gone. Question is how long does it take? And then the bigger question is, does he come back? But I'll get there for you. From reform, we'll go to Eskom and what's happening there. It's the latest data. It's absolutely fascinating. And we'll make some very strong statements on the growth prospects for the economy based on what we read into Eskom. That'll take us to the economy itself. In number 6, we'll reflect on the comments in his budget speech in February of the finance minister and what the long-term growth, debt, deficit, etc. outlook for South Africa now is. And we'll fit in there, I think we did that this morning, I think it's in this briefing, the COVID position for the country and its impact on the economy, and our assessment there, cautiously optimistic. From 6 in the economy, we'll go to living standards. From there to schools and employment. We'll make some brief comments on the world. We do focus on the rest of the world as well as South Africa. The focus for today is 95% South Africa. The 1 or 2 global comments I want to make, because they could have a bearing on what happens here. Briefly, from the equally brief, currencies, commodities and markets. Then the scenarios. What's going to happen in South Africa's next decade? Let's get underway. Number 1, it's the question of the political survival of the ANC. You're seeing charts on your screen. They are polling-based charts. So we produce them. They're our polling numbers. And we have some confidence that they are in the ballpark. When we test now ANC support by age group in the country, you're looking here at a chart. These are percentages off the left-hand axis. You always follow in this briefing my little red dot. Age groups of people in the country. And we now find that for people aged 16 to 50, let's say, under the age of 50, support for the ANC is polling at below 50%. Amongst people who are 50 and older, support sits in the mid-50 percentiles. This is not an election forecast. We turn these things into forecasts, but at this time it's just raw data. It's an insight that's very valuable because on the right of your screen, I show you a breakdown of the South African population by age group to demonstrate that there are now only 10 million people aged 50 and older. Many of these are approaching max life expectancy, whilst roughly 3 times as many potential voters sit in age brackets where support for the ANC is now on the 50% mark. And on the demographic argument alone, regardless of the reform prospects for the country, we can now make the case that the ANC is in a position where it could lose an election, and that could happen as early as 2024. Stay with the theme. Still polling, it's still the ANC, it's still our numbers. We're testing ANC support now by your level of employment. What we find is that for people who are unemployed and looking for work, ANC support is at 53%. For people who are unemployed and not looking for work, it's quite high, at almost 60%. But amongst people who have jobs, whether they're employed in the informal sector or in the formal sector, ANC support now prints out of the polls at a level of below 50%. The same theme comes out when you test ANC support by a person's highest level of education. On the left of this chart, the one you're watching my little laser move around, for people whose highest level of education is a primary school education, ANC support sitting at around 70%. But as we move upwards through the education rankings, people who've got grade 8 to 10, they've had a few years of high school, ANC supports at about 56%. People who've been in their last 2 years of high school or graduated high school, that's on 49. People who've been to university, ANC support is coming in at a very low 31.6%. Same themes repeated if you test ANC support by a person's level of income. The left-hand side of this chart has income categories for people, from people with no or very little income to people with, by South African standards, quite a lot of income. And when we track ANC support against those categories, there are very few people left. Firstly, we must say, we're going to stress this as we go on this morning, that the ANC in government, particularly in that first 10 to 15 years, did much better to raise basic living standards than it was ever given credit for. So there are very few people left in these very low income brackets. But as we get into the sort of low to mid-level income categories, we see ANC support fall away very quickly. And the phenomena at play here is quite unambiguously in the polling that amongst people who have jobs, are better educated, we see it for urban people, people with higher levels of income, support for the ANC has collectively, call that South Africa's middle class, fallen now to a level of below 50%. Hold that there. We're going to build on it and make the case much more complicated. Public opinion in South Africa. What do people want? The best way to know is to ask them. We do that in polling regularly, and here are some of the more recent numbers. The question is really, what is the most serious problem in the country? That is the result that comes back. Unemployment, the creation of jobs, gets the biggest shout. Thereafter, the hot issues of crime, corruption, and services, your circumstances in your community. Relatively far down the list, and this surprises a lot of our clients, are the more populist political questions. such as land reform or questions of inequality or questions of racism and discrimination. And we've read over a long period of time a growing gap in the political world between what the South African government prioritizes in terms of its messaging to offer its supporters, the people of the country, and what we see in polling those people want. And that disjuncture explains for us a part of the reason of why we're seeing ANC support levels amongst particularly middle-class people falling as quickly as they are. But we'll get to more of that just now. The sense we create, perhaps on the previous chart, is that the South African populace is more moderate in its demands, expectations, and interests than the media or social media in South Africa suggests. And that is a view we hold very strongly. And it's a view corroborated in a lot of our polling. This is a very interesting chart. We ask the question, do you believe since 1994 that relations between people of different races in South Africa, so this is the hottest South African question, have those relationships improved? Have they stayed the same? Have they become worse? Or don't you know?
You see that there's next to where I filled in, there's the
This
column
is
for
I see Peter V.
the spouse.
Peter
So if
V.
you just look at your...
Sorry, can you all switch your mics off so that Dr. Cronje can address all of us? Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. I don't mind at all. It happens in these briefings. It's not a problem, but if there's a noise, I'll just tell the person that we can hear the telephone conversation. The results are we think, encouraging. At the end of last year, this was after the decade of state capture, the COVID lockdown induced economic setbacks. 41% of people still held that relations were better than they were in 94. And remember, that benchmark's very high. 94 were the heady days of liberation. A quarter of people still feel that things are the same as they were then, while only a quarter say that things became worse. And our advice to our clients is that, contrary to what you read in the media and the mainstream kind of social media world, the social fabric of South Africa is stronger and more moderate than most analysts suggest. And if we're right on that, it is now one of the most powerful countervailing forces in favor of South Africa's long-term success. So we've made 2 points. We think the ANC can lose an election, it's a broad point. And secondly, we think people are moderate and in the main and pragmatic in their demands. Now, if you add those two together, you get a very interesting idea about what might happen next here. So let's go and look into the politics, what has happened, so we can make the call on what's going to happen next. The chart you're looking at runs from 1994 to 2020, so it's the democratic era. The data I put up first for you, the red bars, are the rate of economic growth, and I show you that so you can hang the politics on circumstances in the country. The economic story we'll get to later is that the first era, really into about 2007, was far more successful in terms of economic performance than the ANC was given credit for. It's inherited a bankrupt state, volatile growth rates that have been flirting with the 0% mark, and they stage a very sound recovery. That's the Asian crisis, 98. It's not our fault. And by 2007, the economy is in its fourth year of averaging a growth rate of 5%. That hadn't happened in South Africa since the first half of the 1960s. Thereafter, the era of state capture, things go very badly wrong. Well, how did this relate to the politics? Well, let's start with the ANC. The ANC comes to power. You read RHS means right-hand side, LHS left-hand side. So we're reading the ANC score, obviously, on the right. About 63% of the vote. It will climb in the second election, and it will climb again in the third of 2004, when under Mr. Mbeki, the ANC is now 6 percentage points stronger than when Mandela led it to liberation. It's an extraordinary thing, and something that's ignored or glossed over. Thereafter, As the economic fortunes changed, ANC support falls away, where most recently under Mr. Ramaphosa, the party is 12 percentage points below the peak it had hit with Mr. Mbeki. That's the Democratic Alliance, the blue dotted line. It starts with very little. It climbs and it climbs and it climbs and it climbs, but it doesn't do so on the last occasion. It stumbles at the very end. Below the DA, we've got the EFF. They split out of the ANC about a decade or so ago. Done well in to get to 10%, yes, but are they? What does that mean? They're very influential. But in a country, I'll show you later, where more than half of young people don't have a job at the end of this difficult decade, huge inequalities, lots of racial nationalist incitement, that a party with the marketing brilliance of the EFF cannot get to much above 10% is for us a comment on the still high level of moderation in public opinion. But down here, the EFF's in the wrong place. It doesn't belong there. It comes out of the ANC. It's a franchise in exile of the ruling party, and its leadership desires a result in the fullness of time where the EFF's leadership will return to Luthuli House as the prodigal sons and daughters, claim credit for the defeat of Jacob Zuma and of Cyril Ramaphosa, state capture and white monopoly capital, and lead the ANC through the final phases of its revolution. And when you do that and you put the EFF back in, you think that isn't it something that now, 25 years into democracy, despite this very difficult era, the collective ANC is still virtually as strong as it was at its peak and stronger than it was when Mandela led it. Hold that thought, because I'm going to show you later that it's misleading. Before that, I'm going to show you something else that's misleading. This blue line is the political performance of the broader opposition. So it's the official opposition plus all the small parties except for the EFF. And if you look at that, you will see that South Africa, the bastion of democracy in the emerging world, or so we like to think of ourselves, Africa's leading democracy, we also try and think that of ourselves. The broader opposition is weaker now than it was at the dawn of democracy. And from that, B-team analysts tell their clients the ANC is rock solid, people vote for it, doesn't matter how it performs, and there's no interest in opposition politics, and therefore politically don't expect much to change. It is a fatal analytical mistake because it ignores what you're about to see here. 1994, 99, and then 4 other dates. These are 5-year intervals. Yeah, these are the elections that South Africa's held, the national ones. And we compare 2 indicators. In red, the number of eligible voters that did not vote, to in orange, the number of people who voted for the ANC. First time out, it's liberation, it's Mandela, it's a rainbow nation, it's a globally hugely significant event. And the relationship between those 2 indicators will never again be repeated. By 1999, things are normalizing and then the gap begins to open. But in 2019, we've reached a quite incredible position where there are now substantially more people who are entitled to vote but choose not to than the number of people who vote for the ANC. These non-voters are very politically astute and informed and politically engaged. This is not voter apathy at all. We poll them, we're convinced of that. Rather, these are people who look at the political world, whether the ANC or the opposition, and say, we don't see anything we like here because nothing resonates with our values and interests. If that changes and a political player reinvents itself or enters the field now that resonates with that slight, more moderate than known public opinion and has a great reach marketing behind it, the effect could be that transition that I told you about in my opening remarks. So 3 points so far. 1, the ANC is in trouble now and it's lost the middle classes. 2, people are moderate. 3, the voting and political market in South Africa is wide open. And the concept, if you add 1 and 2 and 3 together, you get a potential realignment here that will be very exciting. Number 4 is the question of reform. Does the ruling administration understand this, what we've said? Does it appreciate it? Does it take it on board? And will it reform to avoid defeat? The first 3 questions, yeah, it understands very well. The analysis is good in Luthuli House, as always. There are concerns about defeat. Prominent alliance leaders have said as much. But will that lead to reform? Our advice to you today is no, that it won't. And the reasons I set out here for you. Let's start with Mr. Ramaphosa. He is very firmly in command of his party and of his government, and he is increasingly so. Here's an insight into that. Some weeks back, Parliament voted on the question of the public protector, and to overly simplify things, the Ramaphosa faction of the ANC wanted the public protector investigated and gone, and the anti-Ramaphosa faction wanted the person to stay. It's more complicated than that, but it's good enough for my purposes. In that parliamentary vote within the broader ANC family, this was the result. 168 ANC members of parliament voted for the protector to be investigated. At a stretch, we'll call them Camp Ramaphosa. 62 did not vote. They absconded. We can, at a stretch, call them the anti-Ramaphosa, the Mahashula camp, something like that. It's not ideal, but it's close enough. And the EFF, we put them in the ANC family, because that's where we think they belong. They voted, of course, to keep the public protector, for her not to be investigated, because they don't want to be investigated by her. They don't want a new protector to investigate them. Even with the EFF inside the ANC camp, Mr. Ramaphosa still commanded a majority of above 60%. Take the EFF out, which you could rightly do. You could say you don't think they'll return to the ANC. Then his majority in the ANC caucus rises to 70%. Higher than that, in fact, it's a useful insight. So is he going to use that to drive reform? Our answer is he's not. And here is the complicated reason why. This chart that I'll put it up for you here. It's the executive committee of the ANC, 80 ordinary members of that committee. We did background checks on all, and our checks suggest that 41 of the 80, a majority, are implicated in allegations of serious corruption. That is all they are. We're not a law enforcement agency. These are allegations. They could all be perfectly innocent. But we're bold enough on this to state this in public. 8 are definitely not implicated, and on 31, we can't make a call one way or the other. What this means is that even though Mr. Ramaphosa commands a majority within the party and around it, the majority he commands suffers from a problem of institutionalized corruption that has probably implicated a majority of its members. Now, the ANC, if you read leaked ANC executive committee and the like minutes, is acutely aware of the problem of corruption and the damage that it's doing to it politically. So it has to act on corruption, but it cannot act to the extent of inducing a series of sweeping prosecutions across the party and the government, because it would decimate the ranks of its own executive committee. So it chooses instead the strategy you've seen over the past 3 years, which is to identify prominent corruption suspects who are expendable, Mr. Zuma and Mr. Mahashula, there'll be some others, and it engages in a very prominent pursuit of these to make the public think that St. George is fighting the dragon. The pantomime is stretched out over a very long period of time. The drama is built up. The media thinks it's the most exciting drama to report on. And it blunts criticism that the ANC is not moving forward on corruption prosecutions. Our advice to you is that this will remain the strategy into the foreseeable future, and that regardless, Mr. Magashula will go in the end in the same way that Mr. Zuma went. We're sure of that, and some others. But we don't think that we're going to see that result, that type of result, translate into mass prosecutions to clean out the ANC stable. So from a governance perspective, we think ACE can go happily, but we don't think that changes the equation in the greater sense on corruption of government. You could say to us, well, that I mean, politically, the art of the possible. So perhaps you have to, Mr. Ramaphosa could think this is for the best. Can South Africa still reform economically, though? Because there are examples of corrupt economies that have attractive investment climates to an extent, and could we be one of those? Here, our answer is unambiguously no at the moment, and the reason is an assessment of the balance of opinion within the cabinet. That's brought out on this chart. Now, this is as a proportion of full ministers. We judge that only 3% of ministers, we won't get into who they are because it complicates things, are pro-fundamental reform. 16% of the cabinet we think is open to persuasion. But 8 out of 10 cabinet ministers, as they sit there today, we think are of a persuasion that will cause them to stand in the way of the types of reform South Africa needs to position itself over the next decade as one of the world's most competitive emerging markets. And on this chart, I expect it, because it did the same for us, that you look at it and you think it can't be so. It's so at odds with the advice you've received on the reform inclinations of the government. These guys, ourselves, this is too extreme and it cannot be. Hold that for me for now, please, because as we continue, and I show you the deficit, the performance of the school system, the state of the labor market, and the Eskom conundrum, I will go back to this to tell you why our judgment on the reform capacity of the cabinet is as severe as what you see over here. Let's start with Eskom. It's a good place to begin. This is 2020, and it says /3. You see my little red dot? That's the third week of 2020, and we've pushed the data into the 16th week of this year, and it's Eskom. Green is energy availability factor. That is what proportion of Eskom's generating capacity is essentially sent out into the economy. That's a sort of layman's explanation of it. And it sat at about 60% last year around about this time, and it's still at about 60% today. So let's go on though. You get available capacity by deducting from potential generation the planned outage factor. This is a good thing, these yellow bars. This is maintenance that's planned by Mr. Director and is done with a view to running Eskom properly. Then you get unplanned maintenance. These are or breakdowns. These are things that broke down, and then you get other bits of energy that disappear. And if you look at this picture, you might be encouraged. Because firstly, the data makes sense. South Africa does more maintenance in its summers. It stops maintenance to an extent in the winter because it has to raise availability because it's colder and there's more demand for energy. As we move into spring, we do more maintenance, and Andre de Ruyter and his team have held the generating capacity at 60%. You'll change your perspective if I pull you back from a one-year view to a much longer-term view. This one runs from 2011 into the present. The green line is the same green bars, the energy availability factor, which has fallen from 80% to around 60% because unplanned maintenance has unplanned outages have ravaged Eskom. Our sense, quite informed sense, is that Eskom has reached a point where even if it is run properly and efficiently and ceases to be in terrible debt, all of which might not be possible, but even if that happens, Eskom can no longer be relied upon to provide to South Africa the energy it needs in order to emulate emerging market growth averages. And once you factor in what Eskom strategists think they need to take out of production through the rest of this decade, because it's very old, the calculation that emerges is that South Africa needs to get into a position where its private sector is generating as much energy as Eskom is. Now, you will see from the Ministry of Energy moves to allow private producers to start producing more here and there under tightly regulated circumstances. But our insight is that within the cabinet, the idea of the private sector challenging Eskom's monopoly on generation is read as a national security threat and a sovereignty threat and will not be encouraged. And for that reason, we think Eskom energy and shortages will continue to pin South Africa's rate of economic growth to a level of below 2% through the medium term and into the longer term. Now, how does that stack up to what the finance minister thinks? Be there in 1 minute. Let's start with being cautious about what the finance minister says. This data is 2005 to 2023. And what I show you in red, firstly, is the forecast the finance minister gave for the growth rate of the economy in the year in question in his budget speeches in February of each of those years. And it's very interesting. There was a time we must remember, and you definitely mustn't forget, because I'm going to tell you we can go back there, when finance ministers were increasingly optimistic about the growth prognosis and were forecasting very high rates of growth. But for the past decade, finance ministers have become more pessimistic. 2021, you know what's going on there. It's a low base effect number. Never before has a finance minister forecast a rate of growth as low as what Tito Mbowene's 3-year view for South Africa is now. And no one, as you know, is better positioned to know what the reform prognosis is, what the Eskom prognosis is, etc. So we like to say to clients that Tito Mbowene is the strongest corroboration we have for our view that reform is not coming and the energy crisis is not going to be fixed, because if it was, given the outlook for the global economy, South Africa's finance minister would not be forecasting a number of 1.6%. Be warned, though, that as we moved beyond to the era of Mr. Mbeki, the gap between the actual rate of growth delivered in the year in question, that's in orange, opened up relative to the forecast made by the minister. So there's a question of treasury and broader government credibility. And now I think Mr. Mboweni is setting that right. But we still anticipate that 2023 could come in at a rate of below 1%, with considerable downside risks to that number. Now, is this, we don't, I mean, we offer informed opinions, of course, but we corroborate as much as we can with very reliable data sets. And perhaps the most reliable South African data set, if you think on the economy, tested over 60 years, is what we call its lead indicator. This is 1960, where I'm starting, goes to 2020, 6 decades of economic growth in South Africa. On top of that, the lead indicator, it's a composite index produced by the central bank. And the rule is that if you see a lift in the lead indicator, you can anticipate a lift in the rate of growth. All the peaks in the lead indicator hit the peaks in the growth rate roughly, and the troughs tend to hit the troughs. The level of the lead indicator doesn't matter. What matters is its trajectory. And since 2000, you can go pre the financial crisis even, you can go 2007, the lead indicator has been in a flat to negative trajectory, which is to corroborate most strongly that on the 2 to 3 year view, we can't lift above recent levels of growth, and that ties you back to Tito Mbowene's number of 1.6, and it ties you back to our analysis, etc. If we do have a low growth a future ahead of us relative to our emerging market peers, well, what is the consequence? The first one is that the fiscal position becomes ever less sustainable. This is 93 to 2023. That's economic growth in South Africa. That is government revenue, the black line, as a share of GDP, which has hit a record all-time high point in pursuit of levels of government expenditure to GDP, which are alarming. Now compare this era over here to this era over there. It's 2006, 7, 8. And the ANC has recorded a budget surplus for South Africa. For us, the comparison between the thinking, the reformist inclination, the quality of leadership, the quality of the cabinet then and now is without comparison. The minister, who is excellent and a loyal cadre of his party, does what he must and tells the world and South Africans that he will drop expenditure levels by a number of points of GDP while further raising revenue in order to close the crocodile's mouth, the width of which is the budget deficit. Even if he pulls that off that he suggests here, and I don't think he can, and I think austerity, cutting expenditure now, is totally the wrong strategy for the government. It needs to grow the economy. You can't address a low growth problem born by bad policy by cutting expenditure. It's entirely the wrong way around. You wouldn't see anything of the sort in the era of running into 2007. Even if the minister pulls off what he suggests he can do on the 3-year view, the budget deficit will remain at a depth that has only been eclipsed on 3 previous occasions in the history of the modern South Africa, the country formed in the aftermath of the decision on union. There's that data. This is the minister's projection. He's going to close the deficit to a level of just outside 6%. This position was only eclipsed in the 80s as apartheid collapsed under the weight of its contradictions and the decision, of course, of Chase Manhattan, the American bank, not to extend any further money. And prior to that, it's the Second World War and the First World War. Deficits have a habit of triggering political transition. So if you add the deficit figure here to our reform assessments, to the political data we gave you earlier, the case for a significant political shakeup becomes even more interesting. What about COVID in South Africa? We're outfoxed by this pandemic, and we've really struggled to get a handle on it. This is the present position, or the position on the 4th of May. It's the number of active cases per 100,000 people by province in the country, and then South Africa. South Africa on the 4th of May had 37 active cases per 100,000 people. That was disproportionately, though, because of the Northwest, the Northern Cape, and the Free State, which are undergoing third waves, but actually really second waves, because they missed out on much of the second wave. That's what's happening there. In much of the rest of the country, we might have reached a point where immune responses triggered by previous infections are having the effect that vaccinations would. And it's possible now that South Africa might not go through a serious national third wave. I say it's possible. And if it is possible, it's a very useful asset for us as a country, given our slow vaccination rollout. However, if we're wrong in that assessment, and this is a treacherous virus to forecast, the knock-ons for the economy will, of course, be exacerbated, the downsides. Can we be wrong? Absolutely. As analysts, we're very happy to be wrong. And we're very happy for clients to say they disagree with us. We are not here to convince you. We are here to show you how we interpret the environment that we operate in. If we are wrong on reform, on the ANC standing, on growth, on all of that, the good news is we won't be wrong for long. This chart runs from 94 to 2023. It measures debt to GDP. Just to make another point about the ANC of the first democratic era, debt levels inherited at 50%, well, almost by, this is the momentum from apartheid. They cut it in half within a period of 13 years after coming to power. Amazing achievement. And you must, what's valuable in that insight is what was the caliber of the economic policy thinking behind an achievement like this. The line I want to show you is fixed capital formation to GDP. It's a volatile indicator. It's a treacherous one. You must read it carefully. But it's also a useful one. And if we are wrong on what I've told you to date, fundamentally wrong, we will know quickly, because we will see this line begin to lift very aggressively. And if that happens, we will reassess a lot of our advice, but we don't anticipate that occurring. So for us, the economic outlook remains relatively down. What does that mean for living standards in the country? It is fundamental to them, of course. This is 1996 to 2019. That's the number of social grant beneficiaries in South Africa. It's actually the number of social grants that are paid every month. 2 million becomes almost 20 million. On top of that, I show you the number of people with a job in South Africa. And in 2009, for the first time, a very important thing happened, because there were less people working than there were people with social grants. Now, this chart somehow went viral in social media, and it's misinterpreted by its critics. The problem in South Africa is not the grants. The grants were a democratic dividend. They helped to raise living standards, consumption expenditures, 60% of GDP. From a moral perspective, what will you do? Take them away? It's impossible. From a political perspective, it's suicidal. Grants aren't a problem. The problem is jobs. Now, between 96 and 2007, the ANC in government did not experience jobless growth. In fact, it almost doubled the number of people in employment. The trouble on this chart is that after 2008, job growth slumped, and we find ourselves in a position today, similar to where we were at the end of last year, where there are now less people going to work on a regular basis, than was the case more than a decade ago. And politically, it's disastrous. What needed to happen in South Africa is that the number of people with jobs had to double again after 2008, in which event we'd have a largely normal labor market absorption rate and a competitive level of unemployment. Now, I can establish that for you with some conviction on this chart. We've got a few countries here, the Australians through to the United States, and South Africa second from the right. And in the second quarter and fourth quarters of last year, I measured for you an indicator called the labour market absorption rate. It measures what proportion of people of working age have a job. And our figure comes in at just above half of what, here's the norm, but it's also the global norm. We're far off where we should be. Corroborating what I told you earlier, a minute ago, that we needed to again double the number of people with jobs after 2008, and we would have been in quite a strong position with employment. The reason, one of them underpinning, despite the reason underpinning low employment is low growth, and investor uncertainty. You're all investors, and some of you I think are uncertain. But next to uncertainty sits the terrible performance of South Africa's education system, which is awful, but I must show you. What my colleagues have done here on this chart is they're measuring school children, so from 200,000 to more than 1 million, And they've started with the grade 1 class of children in 2008, when there were 1.1 million children enrolled. And they followed that class through its career. 10 years later, it's the grade 10 class of 2017. Almost all the kids are there. It's good. But between grade 10 in 2017, 11 in 18, and grade 12 in 2019, half the children disappear. Only 500,000 of the original cohort go on to write their matric exams. Only 400,000 pass, 200,000 well enough to go to university, and a damningly low 40 to 50,000 kids, or 4% of the total, pass maths and matric with a grade of 50% or higher in a country with a structure of GDP, not after 94, but dating all the way back to the 1960s, has been evolving away from its primary and secondary industries to become an increasingly high-tech, high-skilled services style economy. And the education system, in practice, is deeply influential in locking young people out of the South African economy. Let's reflect back on the cabinet quickly. You remember my judgment was severely harsh. And I've demonstrated one of the reasons for that in the energy ministry that's not willing to do what must be done for South Africa to generate enough energy to emulate emerging market growth rates. The present Minister of Education is a person who has presided over this very unfortunate set of circumstances but remains in place. With education policy not fundamentally altered, it is a second smoking gun for our assessment of why we don't think the Ramaphosa administration is fundamentally reformist, even though we do think it is fundamentally in charge. Go back to the implications of the school system and tie it to what I said to you earlier on labour market absorption. What you're going to see is South Africa's labour market absorption rate for the second and the fourth quarters based on a person's highest level of education. I remember that we want to take that rate to about 70%. Currently, it's sitting at about 40%. There's one category here where it does reach sort of competitive global levels, and that's for South Africans who have a tertiary education. But the next best, South Africans who completed high school, the absorption rate is below 50%. And reflect on the policies of the Minister of Labour, which guided by social justice and other principles, all of which we can, of course, understand, are entirely at odds with the skills base produced by his colleague in the Ministry of Education, and therefore have the effect on the facts of continuing to shut out more than half of young people from the prospect of ever finding a job. That cannot be a descriptor 3 years in of a reform-minded government. Quickly onto the world, and I'll get back to South Africa. We do a lot of global analysis now, because so many of our clients moved into the rest of the world, and we followed them. Relatively optimistic. This is the number of new global daily cases of COVID-19 and new deaths. Horrible scenes, of course, in India. But across much of global GDP now outside of India, one or two other exceptions, the pandemic appears to be on the retreat, which should herald a very strong short term. We're worried about the medium to longer term global economic recovery. Evidence of that's now considerable. This is a great chart. It's 2008 to 2021. It's the Americans. The number of new building permits issued in America as a good indicator of confidence, etc. This deep fall is the peak of America's pandemic, and what a rocketing recovery, now back to the moving average line. And compared to building permits issued in America, the unemployment rate in that country, it's not going to get back to the levels of the end of the Trump era, but at 6%, it's probably going to go back to 5.5%. And that will put it right on the moving average for the US economy of the past 25 years. So the global outlook's starting to look incredibly useful to South Africa if South Africa tried to drive a reform agenda. Into the medium term, we worry about the world. And one of the reasons we worry is this very odd and creative chart put together by my colleague Beki Mahlobo, who has joined us, I believe. His Eskom had cut him off earlier in the day, but he's back again. And what we've done here is we've multiplied the inverse of the price earnings ratio of the S&P 500. So what's that? If the S&P 500 has a price to earnings ratio of, let's say, 25, the inverse is 1 over 25. And that calculation gives you, in a sense, the yield on the American stock market. And we've multiplied that by the yield on 10-year American bonds. Now, yields fall as prices rise. And when we do that calculation back to, well, 30 years here, we now get a number that is lower than anything that any or most investment professionals have living memory experience of. It is an exceptionally expensive world, and a world flush with stimulus cash. And beyond the short-term post-COVID sentiment-driven global recovery, we begin to develop concerns about the outlook for the global economy, which, if it goes south, leaves absolutely exposed to the ravages as a consequence of South Africa that we think on the 2 to 3 year view will become read as one of the world's most fragile economies. The political implications and the winds that blow from America blow to South Africa as well are so profound that there cannot be a more important global strategic intelligence chart for clients to gain a read from what to expect than this one. It's 1949 to 2020. Household wealth in America compared to nominal GDP. And look how that gap has opened since really the end of the Cold War. We think within that gap, that's the inequality gap around the world, that feeds the social movements that drive the political realignments. But our sense is also that behind the gap sits not just capitalism, as held out by Mr. Piketty, but also 4 decades of stimulus policy, which has seen asset prices, the American stock market as one, inflate to precarious levels. And in the fullness of time, we think there is the global risk that of a severe asset price contraction. This is the Fed funds rate, interest rates in America since the 1970s, and that is the S&P 500. And this is the stimulus curve. Where the Americans try to hike rates, they trigger economic crises and contractions. Rates can't sit on the floor forever. They can sit on the floor for a long time. They did, but for a decade into 2017. But if the value of an asset is calculated as its future value divided by the rate of interest, and current policies trigger some degree of inflation and interest rates rise, we could see a global asset price retreat. Why does that matter here? Because by then South Africa will be seen as a very fragile emerging market. And you know what happens to the world's most fragile emerging markets when global sentiment turns sharply negative. These scenarios then for South Africa, I'm just going to do the South African ones. I'm not going to go into the global ones this morning. Then you can fire your questions at us. We think what happens next in South Africa is determined by the answer to 2 questions. Will the ANC sustain to the end of this decade a political majority, or will it see that majority fall to below 50%? And while we wait for the result, will there be an effective reform strategy, or will that never emerge? How those 2 questions are answered suggest 4 plausible future South Africans. The best case we call reform and economic recovery. The ANC is above 50 because it reformed. I'll take you into detail now. A second case is intriguing. The ANC has to lose in order for a new political establishment to be granted the room to drive reform, and we call it defeat and economic reform. What South Africa must avoid at all costs is number 3. The ANC is below 50 and no reform strategy is being introduced because of the consequences of its defeat. And in that case, the South African economy and its democracy and the importance of the standing of that democracy to the ideal of freedom across the world. It's that serious. All bets are off. Top left, we found for clients a way that the ANC can stay above 50 now itself. It doesn't need a bailout from the EFF or anything without reform. How do these work in practice? We'll leave you with these terribly simple circular chart. Scenarios must be very simple. It's the impression, the sense that's conveyed that matters. If it's reform and recovery, you will see imminently sweeping labour empowerment and pro-property rights reforms. The growth rate will begin to lift to realistically average 5% by the end of this decade. The debt curve peaks, the currency strengthens sustainably, not just driven by externalities, like commodity prices, interest rate differentials, and the like. Living standards and jobs start getting back on the trajectory that they were on between 94 and 2007. South Africa doesn't have to reinvent any wheels. It has done this once before. The people who run South Africa were there when it was done. It was done under the ANC. It can absolutely be repeated. If it is, confidence in the ANC will rise again, as I showed you happened between 94 and 2004 as the economic recovery played out. The social grants network was created. The number of people with jobs had doubled. It was a glorious era relative to what came. The ANC's majorities will lift into 2024 and 2029. It is perfectly plausible. It can be done. Mr. Ramaphosa has the power to do it. Around the ANC is the intellect to do it. Question for us is well, the call for us is the opportunity will be let slip. More plausible then becomes bottom right, defeat and reform. It's going to go this way. Reforms, real reforms are delayed. The pantomime of pursuing Ace Magashula around the countryside will not transition into fundamental sweeping change of view on energy policy, education policy, labour market policy, the sanctity of property rights and the like. The ANC is already on the way to surrendering its national majority, which will fall below 50%, 2024's election, if not that, 2029. And South Africa moves into an unstable coalition. Out of that coalition emerges a player, and around it, financed by the same people who financed CR17, that emulates what South Africa had done under its gear policy in the early aftermath of the democratic transition. A sort of, we go back to gear, essentially. A new, smaller political movement guides that. It's got a majority it's got a majority style influence, can build a coalition of a majority. Sweeping structural reforms are introduced, but it takes the political defeat of the ANC to trigger those. And growth, debt, jobs, living standards recover into the 2030s. It's not a bad result, but it's a few years away. The worst case, defeat and collapse. Reforms are delayed. The ANC loses. It needs the EFF to bail it out of trouble. It's EWC, asset prescription and nationalization across the board. Debt and the deficit blow out. Currency printing, the notes you'll send back to your foreign offices, those of you who are diplomats, and to your investment partners, those of you who are in commerce, will be tragic to read. Living standards reverse, civil rights are impeded, and South Africa joins the ranks of very unsuccessful societies. Top left, stasis and stagnation. Reforms are not adopted. Economic exclusion will deepen in South Africa, and so will inequalities. The ANC will find a way to capitalize on that exclusion.
Speaking.
Hi.
Are you speaking to Hazel Matoti?
One of your...
Sorry, can you switch your mic off?
Okay, next one, now I can see. It's red, next one.
That's okay.
Hazel Matoti, I got your call from, I just started here in March.
Yes.
I sent him as an
Hello,
director.
Maxwell.
Maxwell, please switch off your mic.
Office in sent him.
Yes.
Yes, sir. I got.
Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. I will see Maxwell a message.
You can switch off a mic yourself.
Not with my system, unfortunately.
Now, what is going on is I got this yesterday for the first time. And as we are reading through.
Sorry, I'll it's quite important point.
For us to align everything you are saying to a certain account number so that we don't make it.
Yes.
So
well, let's do this. I can't. Let's do this. We'll talk over each other. Yeah, there we go. Brilliant. Right. This block is a very important block, because what begins to happen is the ANC capitalizes on poverty and exclusion to raise its level of support. The idea, the risk you must watch there is this. For 20 years, ANC support levels were driven, we think, by aspirations. In 94, people had great aspirations of what would come after Mandela. And for a decade, the ANC began to meet those aspirations. It did better than its critics accused it of. And so the ANC was rewarded and its support increased. In the second decade, the aspirations were even higher. The ANC did not meet those, so it lost support. But you do face the prospect where you become a very poor country, one where people are hungry, literally so, where they don't have the luxury of aspirations. And when that happens, a demagogic populist politics can gain a foothold of sorts. The risk of it was flagged for you earlier. I didn't mention it in the chart on education, on employment and ANC support, where the highest levels of ANC support we can now identify are amongst people, you might recall, that are unemployed and not looking for work. They are the most desperate of people. We are very worried, even on a personal level, by ideas starting to be circulated around the country that we shouldn't aim so high. We should realize it will take very long to fix energy. Perhaps the best we can do is some more welfare. We can't really get to accelerated levels of employment or investment or infrastructure. If that idea takes hold, the effect will be to crush national aspirations and open the way to a radical political takeover such as the one I warn of here. It is also nonsense, because the history of the country, its modern history, post-94, as I tried my best to demonstrate to you, shows what was achieved here, and we must aim for nothing less over the next decade. For this scenario to work, the next block also has to happen, in that the opposition must flounder entirely, and regrettably, it has done some floundering. And South Africa significantly underperforms its emerging market peers. That's where I'm going to leave it for you today. If you allow me to say one commercial thing. Few of you are clients of the Center for Risk Analysis. We would very much like to change that. We think we offer absolutely unique data and information and insight. And we do encourage you to follow up with my colleagues or myself after this, so that we can add you to our client list. And thank you very much to our Spanish hosts. I will stop sharing and my colleagues will lead me through.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cronje. This is really very, very interesting and has given us a lot of food for thought. I'd like to now invite John Endres to start facilitating the whole question and answer session. John, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Frans. I see that we have a few questions in the chat already, so I'll start off with those, but I'll also invite you to add more questions and also raise your hand if you'd like to address Frans directly. So the first question we have is from Pamina Bora, who asks, do you see an opportunity for the DA to renew itself, to appeal to this non-voting segment?
I don't know. To be frank, there are very wonderful people in the DA. and there's some very brave and wonderful people in the ANC. But as they know who they are. I don't think the DA possesses the strategic or intellectual depth, outside of a few exceptions, to take advantage of the political environment. So they're very important, as are all political parties. An opposition calling the odds, holding the establishment to account, so the DA can do well at times, is critically important. It's not to be dismissive of the DA. I don't believe it has the potential to dominate a future coalition. John.
Thank you, Frans. We have a follow-up question from Hamina, which is, what is the relative likelihood of the 4 scenarios? Which is the most likely?
Okay. Well, usually the first question, but let's say I don't know, which you'll think is totally inadequate. But I will tell you. But you must listen to this warning first. We didn't show you scenarios to waste your time, and we could just have gone to a forecast. We don't think we're good enough to do that. For all the information we have, the first-hand insights, the depth, the decades of experience in South Africa, we're not brave enough to give you one forecast of where it's going. And that is because we have a very good understanding of the failure of sort of a strategic intelligence forecasting around the world, whether done by the private sector or done by governments. South Africa's a good example of that itself, given where we find ourselves today. We did make that call back all the way back in the end of the Mbeki era. We said, here comes trouble. And it was a message our clients found difficult to digest. So we're cautious. I mean, if you were perhaps the most astonishing point to make, you'll get what I mean, is if you were at Mr. Obama's inauguration, I was not, in that crowd of 1 million people, you watched it on television, and he makes his speech and he says, yes, we can, and you listen to that speech and you turn to your friend or your colleague and you say, you know, I think the next man to lead America will be Donald Trump. you would not have been taken seriously. So be cautious about fixed point forecasting. A better strategic approach is to understand what could happen. Gear yourself to developing the proto strategy to respond if your dashboards point one way or another, and try as hard as you can, whether you are here or diplomat or an investor, to push the dial towards the top right quadrant. Having warned you that that is your strategic approach, you mustn't take too seriously my estimations. I don't think top right has much of a chance, because I don't think there is a deep reformist inclination inside the government or the ANC, or very often in organized business. I said in the meeting last night, of a scale sufficient to see South Africa become truly globally competitive. Bottom right, that there'll be a political realignment and that might trigger reform. I think the odds of that are pretty strong. We can measure the demise of the ANC politically in the data. It's a perfectly easy thing to do. We can determine, which I'm convinced of, that public opinion in South Africa is very moderate and would be terribly politically enthusiastic about going back to what the ANC did in the Kier era, when it became more popular than it had been when Mandela had led it. We're a free society. I'm critical of our government. This afternoon, I believe there are sort of indirect associates of the government on the call. No one will berate me too harshly or do anything terrible. I'm perfectly confident to say that I don't think the government's reformist. If you add those things together, the trend line on the ANC is unmistakable. The national population is mainly moderate, and we're a fundamentally free society. You've got to give bottom right. You've got to take it very seriously. So I'd put a lot on that. Bottom left, the terrible collapse of the democracy and the knock-on effects across the region and the emerging world, the implications for the balance of power between China and the liberal West in Africa. I mean, these are very serious results. Take them seriously. There is nothing in South Africa and its people who are wonderful, in its history, which is unique but not exceptional, to say that we cannot become one of the world's most disappointing emerging market performers. And given the economic outlook and the extent of racial nationalist populism in the mainstream, the risk is very serious. Top left, of course, is the lazy cop out, but it's important. It's that the ANC, the change won't happen this decade. It's a holding pattern. If you make me put numbers on the odds, and I'm sort of guessing as I sit here, top right, 10%. Bottom right, 40%. Bottom left and top left, let's split what remains, 25 each way. That's how I'd answer your very important question. John, back to you.
Thank you. Pamina, I see you had another follow-up question. I'm just going to skip over that for a moment. I'll come back to it later. And I'd like to put together a few of the other questions which relate, on the one hand, to an analysis of the tripartite alliance and the ANC. Frans, I'm going to read out a couple of questions that all relate to that topic. The first is, how do you see the tripartite alliance unfolding and the future role of the trade unions movement in politics? Related to that, I often hear the remark that if South Africa got rid of the trade unions, a lot more people will be employed. That seems impossible in practice. What's your thought? And also relating to that, is there a possibility of a split in the ANC along factional lines? And would that be a solution, or is that a simplistic view as a solution to the challenges of our country?
Yeah. Okay, this is a serious question.
Yes.
I think the split in the ANC happened in 2007 at Polokwane, because what was jettisoned there was the pragmatism that Mandela had sought to introduce in his 1992 Davos speech. And it marked Davos in 92, one of the great ideological turnings in the ANC. The first, not really a turning, is the establishment of the party in 1912, a staid, pragmatic, even conservative by modern standards movement. It remains that into the late 1940s, when it's in later post-World War hounding by the Nats drives it into the arms of the East Germans and the Soviets, which infuses the party with a lot of, well, then Soviet ideology. And it will remain that really from the most important is probably its conference at Morogoro in 1962, I think. 1962 to 1969, Morogoro, I forget. For about 20 years after Morogoro, it remains ideologically a copy of Soviet dogma. Perfectly understandable why. That changes in 92 at Davos. Mandela changes direction economically. I think that was a far greater contribution even than reconciliation. Motivated, we think, by his understanding and that of his de facto prime minister, Thabo Mbeki, that the whites had made such a mess of the economy that if the ANC did not reform to attract investment, it would be begging for money from the IMF by the end of the 1990s, which would surrender policy sovereignty and bring an end to the revolution. So the ANC becomes very pragmatic after Davos, and it isolates the relative left in its ranks. It records a budget surplus, need we say more? And that is all lost in 2007. It's one of the great ideological turnings of this movement, equivalent to the Morogoro conference, equivalent to so many things. That needs to be set right, but it can't. Because the victors of Polokwane, who defeated Mbeki and the pragmatism of the ANC, the Zumites on the one hand and the sort of populist left of the ANC on the other, have in the ensuing decade crushed between them what was the reformist inclination of that party. So I think the turning was 2007. The reason Mr. Ramaphosa, we had a call last night, very interesting, John was on it as well. I mean, if you talk about a cabinet reshuffle in South Africa and Mr. Ramaphosa shuffles out some of the ministers who aren't reformers, well, who's he going to put in their place? If you look at the ranks of the executive committee of the party. The reason he's in that predicament is because the reform-minded thinkers are gone and they're not showing any sign of coming back. So I think the movement has changed fundamentally. It no longer has reformist potential, and it doesn't have the ruthless leadership of Mr. Mandela to bring that about. As for trade unions and their influence, well, firstly, they're critically important, trade unions. If we didn't have trade unions, we'd have anarchy in the streets. We have some anarchy in the streets, but it's not because of trade unions at all. And so trade unions are very important. The private sector in South Africa has got out of the union business. If you look at the membership of trade unions, it's increasingly concentrated in the state, and the conflict as the state moves to austerity, which I think is a very bad idea, whilst trying to retain its trade union allies, will create various political and fiscal tensions over time. Is there a future split in the ANC? Not so much a split as a reformation, in that there is an outside chance that it might be possible that, perhaps prompted by the shock of an actual political defeat, the better, more reform-inclined sides of the ANC could attract back into their ranks the technocrats of the Mbeki era, who, together with the more pragmatic of the broader opposition, even though none of them are very wonderful either, as I've said, you could, but you're not looking for a future split. You're looking for a reformation to put back into the ANC what it kicked out when it booted Thabo Mbeki in 2007. John, I think I've addressed most of that.
Thank you, Frans. That was a comprehensive answer to a whole series of questions. Let's turn to the opposition next, Frans. We have one question, which is, what about Mashaba's possibilities? Will he be able to recruit a significant account of the non-voters? And sort of linked to that, in February this year, we saw Julius and Zuma having tea. What was it about? And
look,
how the EFF grows or changes.
Sometimes these questions are difficult because, I mean, we have infinite respect for our clients, so we'll never soften a message, but we also, wish to be polite to the subjects of our analysis. Mr. Mashaba's instincts might be right in that he is aiming for, he's a capitalist. I mean, he's not apologetic of that. He's an arch anti-racist. It's the textbook definition of the kind of black conservative movement that the ANC of Gear essentially was and is lost now. But he is poorly advised to such an extent by people who don't have a good track record in strategy that he cannot succeed, and he'll poll very low and won't do very well. But I think what Herman's trying to do is important, because he'll fail. But his failure will lie on the political battlefield where someone else might come along and pick it up. Because it's not really his invention, this. It really is. I mean, Herman's messaging really is the ANC of Gear of those decades past. And Herman's willing to have a fight with his ideological adversaries, which is useful. He won't make it politically. What was the next bit of that, John? Oh, that Zuma had tea with Malema.
Yes.
Oh, they're both afraid of being sent to jail if they are prosecuted en masse. As you know, the ANC has, I said what its strategy on corruption was. It's to find a prominent target and chase that target with good reason. I mean, Mr. Zuma, I'm sure a court might convict of a crime. I don't know, mustn't judge, but so it would appear. You chase a prominent target in order to tell the public that you're doing your best to fight corruption while not actually fighting the institutional problem. Once Zuma went, you needed a new target. So you got Ace Magashule. And Ace Magashule, it might be drawn out, it might be terrible long-term trauma and drama, but he'll go in the end. My worry on Ace Magashule is not whether he'll go, but whether he'll come back, because the charges against him in the Free State are not kind of blowing us away, and he might be acquitted. And if he's acquitted, he's coming back as the conquering hero. So my worry is not whether he'll leave. My worry is whether he will return. Once he's, let's say he's gone and Mr. Zuma is now pursued, and what will the ANC offer the public as the next culprit? And as the EFF is a rival of sorts, threatens many in the ANC. I mean, they admire some of the populist nationalism. I think they enjoy it, but they also don't want to work for Julius Malema as the future leader of the ANC in some form or another. He might become a target. And I think that's what that meeting was about. Zuma as a political force is nothing. Really, there's nothing to worry about at all. These legions that will come to his defense to bring the country to a halt if he's sent to prison, there's nothing like that. He's a spent force. If you go back to the Nasrec conference of the ANC, Mr. Ramaphosa's popularity ranking amongst ANC members was so eye-watering that any of you who are familiar with American and European popularity figures will think there must have been a mistake. I think he was 30 or 40 points ahead of Dr. Dlamini Zuma. Not 3 or 4, which is a big lead. 30 or 40. The ANC rank and file is not going to go and bat for Jacob Zuma. John, what's next if we have the time still?
Thank you. If we have the time, I will link another 2 questions. This is Pamina's follow-up question, which was, if you could pick one area for reforms that will have the biggest impact, what would it be? Energy over education, for example. And I will link to that Roberto's question, who thanks you very much for your useful insights and says business could be a game changer in pushing for reforms. Is fragmentation the problem, or what else? And what would be a better synergy between foreign and domestic investor help?
Okay. Big reform, property rights, I think. As long as that's a doubt, it's a red light over the investment door, you'll never get the capital, foreign or domestic, that you need. And I think the understanding is better than it's been, that expropriation policy is not something to do with land reform in the main. It opens every asset class to seizure. And if you add to that the implications of the Papuda legislation, there's a real question mark over property rights across the board. There are property rights a bit like pregnancy. You kind of are or you're not. And you can't be halfway. And if you're halfway, there's a big competitive emerging market world out there trying to draw your investment capital away. So property rights is number one. Thereafter, it would be labor. It would be the triumvirate. You can't. One thing doesn't do it. It's labor, employment. I mean, it's labor and employment, labor, education, and empowerment policy. You need to get the balance between the 3 right. You need to give communities greater control over what happens in their schools, because the South African local research shows that delivers, with the same resources, much better education results. There's no budget problem on education. What we spend per capita as a share of GDP is competitive, but our results are not. On labor, you've got to price poor people into work to a greater extent. And on empowerment, you must do this. Firms who invest in South Africa must win empowerment points for 4 things: fixed capital contribution, employment, tax payments, and exports. The bulk of your scorecard must reflect that contribution. Those are the building blocks of real empowerment and transformation. They align, to answer the question, the interests of the business community with the interests of the society via empowerment policy much better than is presently the case. where the empowerment policy does not in fact address the needs of the economically excluded in the country. Get that balance right, and South Africa has every prospect of becoming an incredibly exciting and competitive emerging market towards the end of this decade and into the 2030s.
Good. Frans, I think we've almost reached the end of our time, but there are another two questions which I will link. I will try to fit them into one box. And this is related to a little bit to the external environment of South Africa. This question comes from Joe Mabena, who asks if there's a risk of Islamic fundamentalist infiltration in the top left scenario. And the second question is from Sergio, who points out that the Rand has been by far the best performing currency compared to other emerging rise in the price of commodities, especially platinum and palladium. So he suggests that this might pose a risk for the South African economy, that it depends too much on the commodity price. He also points out that the agricultural sector grew quite strongly due to positive rainfall. And the question he asks is, do you not think that external factors will play a key role in the future of the South African economy? I sometimes believe we focus too much on the internal sector, but in reality, most of the factors are external. What do you think?
Okay, you might just have to repeat one or two of those. I'm very pleased that I've got the question on Islamic fundamentalism. We don't get that one often, and you're in luck, because we were briefed last night by a very brilliant Islamic analyst on security questions in the region. We corroborated views we had. We think there is a problem of Salafi jihadism across the sub-region. We think there's a phenomena of an Africa terror belt that runs from Northern Africa, from Yemen across the Gulf of Aden, and then down through Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and ends up in somewhere in the Western Cape and in Natal. And that the events we saw in Mozambique are not once-off or tangential, and there is a problem, definitely, and the region is not well positioned to respond to it. And South Africa is certainly not in the clear. And if you Google us through time, you'll know that even long before this Mozambique thing, we had warned clients that we do think there is a problem here. And that Southern Africa, in the fullness of time, now we're long-term analysts, given the crystallizing of power balances now in the Middle East, we think Africa has the risk of becoming the global terror frontier. So that's quite a statement to make. On the question, John, just prompt me, what was next?
It was commodities prices and whether we're dependent on external markets.
Yeah. Well, it's always been a commodity currency and a sort of commodity country, and we've seen that very clearly. And the typical risk-on pattern plays itself out now. Iron ore, copper price goes up, dollar weakens, rand strengthens on the back of that, supported further by the interest rate differential between bonds here and those in the United States, a differential that's doubled over the past decade. So, yeah, good news for the rand, probably in as far as the global post-COVID recovery extends. Beyond that, so I expect a sort of the trend you've seen to be sustained into the end of that global recovery. Thereafter, I'm worried, because if the global recovery ends in an asset price contraction, that could be a few years away. We made the point to you. And at that point, when the world is shocked, the whole recovery narrative is now broken. We're into the fifth decade of stimulus, and this asset price shock occurs. If South Africa is then better understood to be a country that is unlikely to be led to reforms by its government, which will then still be the government of Mr. Ramaphosa, we will be read as the most fragile of the fragile emerging markets. And so your currency can do a nice drift back. It's going through 14, maybe it touches 12.50. I wouldn't be astonished. But I do watch the Argentinians who leapt from 15 to 80 in a period of 24 months on the dollar exchange rate. The circumstances were different. the external debt profile was different. Yeah, we know all of that. But we have this concern that the good news on the currency eventually runs out. Without reform, it has to. It won't be sustained. Last one, John, what was the last bit?
Those were the last questions I have on the list so far, Frans.
Fantastic. Well, let me quickly, you don't have to come back to me. I have someone coming for lunch and I have to cook for them, so I need to go. But I want to say to you all, thank you very much. It was great to be here, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to engage with many of you in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cronje, and it's really been very empowering this morning. And I'd like to take this opportunity of also thanking John for facilitating this morning, Sherwin putting it together, and the whole CRA team will be really, without you, this morning couldn't have been possible. Thank you for everyone that has attended. Please, we will be sending out the video and the presentation to you with the contact details for CRA. Do get in touch with them. They do empower you. Thank you all very much. Keep well and stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.